views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Hi, and welcome to Open BxRx Tuesday on BronxNet, a weekly program providing you with the latest information, resources, services, and community efforts taking place locally here in the Bronx and virtually. I'm your host, Kibin Alleyne. Coming up, in recent months, the issue of inflation has become a major concern for many Americans. An economics professor joins me to discuss the rising cost of living. What has been causing inflation? After that, for decades, environmentalists urge leaders around the world to address issues regarding climate change. The executive director for the NYC Climate Action joins me to discuss NYC greenhouse gas emissions and how it affects New York. Are NYC buildings contributing to this problem? Then, with the announcement of the puppy mill pipeline bill, animal rights activists are speaking out in support of the bill. The president of the Voters for Animal Rights joins me for a discussion. What are the dangers of puppy mills? And finally, the national spokesman for Jehovah Witness joins me to discuss interracial marriage and its presence within their faith. Why are mixed marriages not uncommon for Jehovah Witnesses? So please stick around. Open BxRx Tuesday starts now. Welcome to Open BxRx Tuesday on BronxNet. I'm your host, Kibin Alleyne, and I'd like to invite you to get social with us at BronxNet TV on Instagram and Twitter, and BronxNet Community Television on Facebook. In recent months, the issue of inflation has become a major concern for many Americans. Joining me to discuss what's causing inflation in our country is Matthew Nagler, professor of economics at City College of New York and the Graduate Center of City University of New York. Matthew, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, good to be here.
Now, we've seen increased price changes in our everyday lives towards household items, food, and more, and we know this is called inflation. Can you actually explain what inflation is?
Yeah, so inflation is just a very simple thing. It's an increase in the cost of things. It's an increase in the level of prices. It can be limited to certain areas of the economy, so you might see a rapid increase in prices for something like healthcare services, while other prices stay fixed. Or it can be broad-based across a wide array of goods, across the entire economy.
Now, can you explain what's causing inflation?
Yeah, right now we have a very unusual mix of factors. You'll remember that back in the thick of the pandemic, we had a stimulus package that was introduced by the administration. And so, that's sort of what the stimulus is doing, is putting a lot of cash into the economy really quickly. Now, this is not the first time that the government has done something like this, and usually the economy can withstand that sort of an action, a stimulus, without inflation resulting. But a couple of other factors came into play that resulted in the inflation. The first one was that because it was the pandemic, people were not doing a lot of the things that they normally do. They were not traveling. They were not going to restaurants. So when they got this check, when they got this extra money, they were spending it all in a very limited area of the economy. They were spending most of it on durable goods. So they wanted to spend it on durable goods because they weren't traveling or going out or anything like that. So you have a lot of money chasing a very small sector of the economy. So kind of, it's like taking a lot of water and forcing it into a really narrow tube. At the same time, you have something going on the supply side. The people that normally would be producing these durable goods, like cars and furniture and stuff like that, many of them are not going into work. And so I think this is something we've heard a lot about over the past year or so, that there's been shortages of certain goods, like you have to wait a while to be able to get a car because plants are not producing at the same rate that they normally do. So you have all this money and it's chasing these durable goods, but there just isn't the supply to meet that demand. And when you don't have the supply to meet demand, the only thing that can happen is that prices will have to go up in order to bring supply and demand back into equilibrium together. So that's what we've observed. Now, you add on top of that some additional more recent factors. We have the Ukraine war, which started in February. And what that has done is it's pushed up the price of gasoline quite substantially. And so you kind of add that on top of the existing situation. And then you get another factor coming into play, which is inflationary expectations. And that's just very simply that once people start to notice that there's inflation, they start to expect it going forward. And if you expect there to be inflation, then very often what people will do is they'll say, I've got to spend my money now, because if I wait and don't spend it now, if I spend it a month from now, I'm going to be able to buy less with it. So I got to spend it now. So you already had a lot of money chasing very few goods. Now you have all of that even more because people are trying to spend it as rapidly as possible. So that pushes up inflation even further.
So I'm really glad that you kind of brought up all those reasons. I think it's so interesting that we're seeing so many reasons for this. Now, is this something that we've seen previously, that there were multiple reasons for inflation in our country, or is this the first time that we're seeing there's so many causes?
Now, this is usually what we see. I mean, often when we look back at periods when we've had inflation in the past, we tend to focus on one factor that seems dominant that we just remember, such as back in the 1970s when there was inflation. We tend to remember the oil shocks. There was a huge restriction in the supply of oil because OPEC, the oil-producing nations, restricted oil production, and also because of some political factors in terms of our relations in the Middle East region. Because of those things, we saw the prices rise, but there were other contributing factors at the time as well. It's just that's the most salient factor there. But usually it's multiple factors that lead to inflation.
Okay, now, according to NBC, the Consumer Price Index rose 8.6% in May from a year ago, the highest increase that they've seen since December of 1981. Can you first explain what is Consumer Price Index and how it's measured?
Yeah, the Consumer Price Index is a way in which the government calculates inflation. What they do is they take what they call a market basket of goods. They identify a number of consumer products across the economy. And they say, we're going to take a look at the prices just of these goods. Now, the reason they do that is it's too hard to calculate the prices of every single good that's out there. I mean, there's thousands of goods and services too. So like, when you pay for services, like if you go to the movies, or if you get cellular service or something like that, those are also things where prices might be increasing. So what the government does is they restrict their attention to this market basket, and they say, okay, so what's happening with the prices of these things? And they use that as an index for inflation. So they calculate a price level at a certain point in time, say a certain base year, like 1980, and then they take a look at the same set of goods in a future, a year closer to the present, like maybe like this year, and they look at how that the average price of those goods in that market basket has increased, and that becomes our index or our measure of inflation. So that's really, in a nutshell, what the Consumer Price Index is.
Okay, so now my next question kind of leads into something else a little bit, and I want to know if they're even connected. Does this occurrence mean that we're heading towards a recession? I know that we hear these terms kind of thrown around a lot. Can you just explain that?
Yeah. So actually, it seems almost kind of contradictory, because if you've taken a basic economics course, you may actually have heard that, and it tends to be true, that inflation and recession are actually sort of opposites when it comes to the economy. So usually inflation occurs when the economy is booming, but a recession is when the economy is doing just the opposite. So why are we hearing that the current inflation is going to eventually result in a recession? Well, the reason is that in order to deal with inflation that is out of control, the Federal Reserve, which makes monetary policy in this country, needs to do some pretty dramatic things. They need to raise the rate of interest, okay? And what that does is it discourages, investment. It does certain things that can actually bring price levels down if they can do it for a sustained period of time. But the negative effect of that is that when you increase interest rates, you also can bring about a recession. You can cause companies to, demand for goods will fall off, and that will cause prices to drop, but that's also going to cause companies to want to lay off their workers. And so that's why a recession can often follow if we're, actually in the process of trying to bring inflation under control.
Okay, thank you so much for explaining that because I feel like we often hear these words get thrown around, but we're like, what does this actually mean? And are they even connected? So I appreciate that. Now, is there a way to financially prepare for something like this?
You know, really, I think that's a very good question. And I think a lot of people respond to inflation, as I said, by saying, well, gosh, I mean, if I think prices are going to go up more, I better spend more of my money now. And in situations where, in fact, inflation is really out of control, that's what people in the past have done to respond to it. So you had, some really major examples of inflation, like hyperinflations that occurred between World War I and World War II. You had, basically people never saved any money. They took, as soon as they got a paycheck, they spent it all. So that was how people responded. In our current situation, I don't think things are as dire, so I wouldn't encourage people to do that. I think that we kind of have to recognize that this is short run and it's going to end and it's not going to get much worse probably. Really the best thing to do is it's always a good idea, no matter what the economy is doing, to try and set some money aside and have some savings in case, of uncertainty. So, for example, if there's a risk that you might lose your job because of a future recession, you want to have that cushion of savings. So having a cushion of savings is always a good idea. And so I recommend that, that people engage in personal financial planning, that you set a budget for how much you think you should be spending each month, and set aside a certain amount of money to save.
Now, what will it take for us to recover from issues with inflation? And is this even something that we can recover from?
Yeah, as I said, I don't think that inflation raises any long-term severe concerns. We will recover, and eventually, probably because the Fed will raise interest rates as they've already begun to do, inflation will be brought under control. Even in the most severe instances of this in the past, such as 1981, when there was a relatively severe inflationary period that was followed by a very sharp increase in interest rates, there was a recession. There was about a year, I think, of difficult times, but it was followed by a sustained recovery, several years of very good times. So I think it's important for us to take the long view and recognize that even though there might be some difficulty in the short term, that eventually the economy will recover and we'll all be doing much better.
What can people do to educate themselves on the effects of inflation and just to learn a little bit more about it? I know for me, this is like kind of new. So what can people do to educate themselves?
Yeah, well, other than taking a course in economics, which I recommend for everybody, I think it's also a good idea to read what economic writers are writing about in newspapers and also online. It's good to find somebody who's reputable. Don't always necessarily listen to what you hear on Facebook, but find a reputable writer, maybe in the New York Times or in NewYorkTimes.com, and educate yourself by reading what they have to say about inflation. Most professional economists will be able to give you a pretty good explanation, but there's other people that know the economy well, and so definitely do a lot of reading.
All right, Matthew, thank you so much for joining me.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
We'll be right back with more Open BxRx Tuesday. Welcome back. Climate change remains one of the largest issues affecting our planet. For decades, environmentalists have urged leaders to address these issues and to act now before it's too late. Joining me to discuss climate change in NYC, greenhouse gas emissions, and more is Executive Director of NYC Climate Action, Stephanie Margolis. Stephanie, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Now, can you tell me a little bit about your organization?
Yes, the New York City Climate Action Alliance is a nonprofit working with those in the private sector and civil society to help New York City achieve its ambitious climate goals. Essentially, we need to decarbonize, and so we're here to help support everyone along the way so that we can make sure that we are avoiding the devastating consequences of greenhouse gas emissions in our atmosphere.
Now, as I mentioned, climate change is the most critical and urgent issue facing our world, really. However, I think there are many people who are just still very unclear about what that is. Can you explain what climate change is?
Yes, so climate change refers to long-term shifts in temperatures and weather patterns. The shifts may be natural. However, what we've seen, and especially since the early 1800s, is that human activities have been the main driver of climate change, predominantly from the burning of fossil fuels, such as coal, oil, and gas, which produce greenhouse gas emissions, which get trapped in our atmosphere and then heat up our environment.
Okay, so I guess for example, would a really cold day in the summertime, would that be considered climate change?
There's no one thing that's considered climate change. A cold day in the summer is not considered climate change. A warm day in the winter is indicative of these larger trends of increasing temperatures that are driven by the fact that it's humans are burning fossil fuels rather than, leveraging our energy sources from renewable energy, such as solar, such as wind. So it's more indicative of larger trends, not one specific day, is indicative of climate change.
Got it. Thank you so much for explaining that. Now, what are some common things we as a society do that contributes to these issues of climate change?
So essentially, a lot of what we do contributes to climate change. Everything from powering our buildings to driving our cars to eating different food to throwing out trash, all of these aspects impact climate change. So when you think of it within buildings, every time you turn on your lights, you're consuming energy. And energy is produced by burning fossil fuels or it's produced from renewable energy. And so we need to be really mindful about all of the different ways that we consume energy in order to mitigate the impacts of climate change.
Now, I know you mentioned it a few times, and I'm not really sure what this means. Can you explain what fossil fuels are?
Yes, so fossil fuels are different forms of energy. And so, for example, you can burn oil, you can burn coal, you can burn natural gas. And in the process of burning those, you generate energy. And then energy is used within your homes. When you turn on the light switch, you're using energy. When you run your dishwasher, you're using energy. And so we want to make sure, in addition to reducing our energy consumption, we want to make sure that we're also transitioning how we produce energy from fossil fuels to renewables.
Now, how are we seeing the effects of climate change across the globe, but also here in New York City?
So there are a lot of ways that we're seeing the impacts of climate change in our daily lives. First of all, there's increased storms, there's additional flooding, there's greater heat waves. So for example, last summer alone, heat waves killed hundreds of people in the United States, specifically the Pacific Northwest, also in Canada. Floods devastated Germany and China. Wildfires raged out of control in places like Siberia, Turkey, and Greece. And New York City is also feeling the impacts of climate change. In many places throughout the city, there's something that's referred to as sunny day flooding. And sunny day flooding is when it's beautiful outside, blue skies, sun in the sky, yet there is still an inch of water on the sidewalks because the water has come up from the bottom of the ground That's what's referred to as sunny day flooding. And that's because we're not able to drain our water as well because we have increased storms. In addition, last summer, New York City surpassed the previous record for the rainiest hour, not once, but twice. The first time we had Central Park collected 1.94 inches of water within 1 hour. And then just 2 weeks later, we smashed through that record and experienced 3.15 inches of rain in a single hour in Central Park. And that was from Hurricane Ida. And, with that storm, water came flooding into the city. It cascaded down the subway steps, and it completely shut down the system. So in addition to, feeling the devastating impacts of climate change from increased storms, it also has economic impacts. It shut down the subway. Folks weren't able to get to and from work. They weren't able to get home. And so we really need to be paying attention to climate change and doing everything that we can to be mitigating the impacts of climate change.
Well, I'm really glad that you brought that up, the economic impact, because I don't think a lot of people often think about that. Can you tell us a little bit more about why that's actually really important?
Yes. So, for a very long time, there hasn't been that much effort given to climate change because it's always been considered as a future problem, a problem for those in the future to pay attention to. However, there are significant economic impacts of doing nothing. The cost of doing nothing is not that you won't have to spend money now to mitigate climate change in the future, because you will be experiencing significant economic impacts of climate change. Workers might not be able to get to and from work, so you're going to decrease your revenue as an organization. If we're not taking care of the environment, you're going to run into supply chain issues, and so then the costs of goods are going to go up. You're seeing right now the cost of gasoline is rising because we don't have access to an endless supply of natural gas. And so there are significant economic impacts of climate change in addition to environmental and health impacts as well.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing that, because I do definitely think there's this idea of what climate change is and why it's important, but I've never heard that aspect before, so I appreciate you sharing that. Now, I understand your organization is addressing how New York City buildings can also contribute to this issue. Can you further explain?
Yes. So we focus specifically on buildings because buildings emit the largest greenhouse gas emissions out of every single sector in the city. In New York City, buildings contribute about 70% of the city's greenhouse gas emissions. Transportation contributes, about a quarter of that. And then the rest of the greenhouse gas emissions come from waste. And so because buildings contribute the largest amount of greenhouse gas emissions to our city, that's really how we're focusing on, we're really focusing all of our efforts there. And the reasons why buildings contribute so much energy is because there's significant energy usage within buildings. There's the burning of fossil fuel on site to heat and to cool buildings. We use a lot of energy in our homes in addition to heating and cooling, from lighting, from what's known as plug loads, which is anything that you plug into an outlet. So your refrigerator is constantly plugged in, your TVs, even though they're not always in use, those are constantly plugged in. And so we're using a lot of energy in our homes. And so we really need to, because we're using so much energy in our homes, that's why buildings contribute so much to the city's overall greenhouse gas emissions. And so we really need to make sure that we're reducing the amount of energy that we can in homes. And by homes, I mean where you live, but also where you work, and also where you shop, and also where you go to school, every single type of building.
Now, I know there have been some efforts to implement change to these buildings, and I think I've actually have seen it myself. Some buildings will have a paper on the door to talk about the energy that's been saved. I've never really looked at it that much before, but now that I'm thinking about it, I'm like, oh, this may be related. So can you actually tell me more about that?
Yes, definitely. So the city and the state really, New York City and New York State really do understand the impact of energy consumption within our built environment and have really set nation-leading laws. So at the state level, you have something that's called the CLCPA, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. And there are a variety of different metrics and targets associated with the CLCPA to reduce the state's energy consumption and to reduce the state's dependence on fossil fuels. One of the targets associated with the CLCPA is to transition to zero emissions electricity by 2040, which means that we need to be generating electricity not by burning coal or oil or natural gas, but we need to be generating electricity from renewable energy such as wind power, solar power, or geothermal power. So the state has enacted the CLCPA. New York City has enacted something that's known as Local Law 97, which is a first of its kind legislation that sets carbon emission limits for buildings. And so if you're a building that's over 25,000 square feet, you need to stay within the emissions limit that is set for your building based on the use of your building. So whether you're a residential building, whether you're a commercial building, whether you are an industrial building, so your building will have a cap on the amount of emissions that you can, on the amount of carbon that you can emit, and you must stay within it or face a fine. And then Kibin, like you mentioned, there's also the energy grade. So we're trying to raise awareness of how much energy you're using. So you can see some buildings that have an A grade, which means that they are consuming energy as efficiently as possible. You have some buildings, and the majority of buildings actually have a D grade. And so it's a way to help you, understand compared to your peers how you stand. And then from there, you can work with experts, you can work with consultants, engineers, architects to figure out ways that you can reduce your energy consumption and your carbon emissions from your buildings.
Wow, that's really cool. I never really knew exactly why it was there, so it's really cool to hear why I'm actually seeing that. Now, the Supreme Court recently curbed the EPA's power to limit greenhouse gas emissions. Why do you think there's so much pushback when it comes to protecting our planet?
So, what it really comes down to is people are just afraid of change. For so long, we had been burning fossil fuel from coal plants, and there is concern about industries dying. And the fossil fuel industry is really very well funded, and fossil fuel technology is really embedded within our systems and our society. However, we have proven that energy efficiency and a transition to a clean energy economy really works both economically as well as in terms of health impacts. And so we really just need to continue educating everyone on the issue so that we can continue to move forward. And while it's frustrating for me that it's change will be incremental, I feel very confident that we have very smart people in the industry working on this, and that we will continuously educate younger generations, as well as politicians, as well as those in power, as well as CEOs of organizations, as well as members of the board of residential buildings, to really educate everyone so that we can move forward with the right actions to mitigate the impacts of climate change.
Well, I definitely learned so much today, and I really appreciate that. Can you just let everybody know where they can go to learn more about the work that you're doing?
Certainly. So you can visit our website. We are the New York City Climate Action Alliance. Our website is newyorkcityclimateaction.org. We also have a Twitter account. Our handle is NYC Climate Act. We also have an Instagram page. Our handle there is Change the Climate NYC. There are also a lot of other nonprofits in the city focused on energy consumption. The city itself, the Mayor's Office of Sustainability. The state also has great resources. And so there are lots of opportunities for you all to get involved if you're interested. And I hope that you do.
All right. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much.
We'll be right back. Welcome back. When looking for a furry friend, your first thought may be to check out your local pet shops. However, you could be supporting an operation harmful to an animal's well-being. With the announcement of the puppy mill pipeline bill, animal rights activists are speaking out in support of the bill. President of the Voters for Animal Rights, Allie Taylor, now joins me for discussion. Allie, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Can you briefly tell me about your organization?
Sure. So Voters for Animal Rights is a New York statewide organization, and we work to elect candidates who support animal rights. We work to hold our elected officials accountable to humane voters, and we work to pass legislation to stop animal cruelty.
Now, before we can truly understand the importance of this bill, can you tell everyone what a puppy mill is?
Sure. A puppy mill is a mass breeding operation where the mother dogs are relentlessly bred over and over and over again to breed as many puppies as they can for profit. The mother dogs are provided little to no vet care. They live in awful cages with wire flooring, little to no weatherproofing. When they get sick or injured, they do not receive vet care. And at the end of their lives, when they can no longer be producing puppies for a profit, and they no longer are considered to have value to the mass breeding facilities, also known as puppy mills, they are killed in ways that I do not want to describe today because they're very graphic. Sorry, go ahead.
Now, you talked about it a little bit, but I'm curious to know, why is this harmful to a dog's health?
Sure. Well, like I said, these puppies are bred over and over and over again. And we're not talking about small breeding operations where somebody might breed a dog in their home. And just as a side note, it's never a good idea to be breeding animals while there's thousands and millions of animals waiting for good homes and shelters. But this is not a small operation. These are massive operations where these dogs solely exist just to be bred over and over and over again until they can no longer produce a profit. There's very little recovery time in between litters. There's no vet care. There's no type of relief for them. And like I mentioned, at the end of their careers, I hate even saying the word careers because this should not be considered a career for a dog. At the end of the time that they are abused, mass producing puppies, they are discarded of.
Now, you talked a little bit about the conditions of these puppy mills. They sound really, really terrible. Like, can you just let us know where this is usually happening or where this is taking place? Because I've never heard of this before.
Sure. This is happening all over the country. This is happening in Pennsylvania. It's happening in Missouri. It's happening in many southern states. And it's also happening right here in New York. 7 of the worst breeders are actually right here in New York State. And the reason that New York is a huge priority for passing this legislation is that by shutting down the puppy mill pipeline in New York, by passing this bill that says you can no longer sell dogs, cats, or rabbits in pet stores, this is sending a huge economic message to the rest of the puppy mill pipeline throughout the country that New York is not going to continue supporting this.
Now, can you tell us how pet shops are contributing to this problem? Because I thought for a very long time, a lot of people associate pet shops with care for animals and, they think that animals are being treated well, but these pet shops could be contributing to this. So can you just let us know a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. That's a great question. Every single pet shop in New York State that is selling animals is directly contributing to the abuse and exploitation of puppies, kittens, and rabbits, and other animals as well. Every single time you buy a dog, a cat, a rabbit, or another animal from a pet store, you are directly supporting these out-of-state breeders and these massive factory farm-like operations where these mother dogs are bred over and over again. And these dogs are shipped thousands of miles away to New York City and New York State pet stores. No reputable breeder would ever sell a dog to a pet store. They would sell directly to a consumer.
Now, are all breeders harmful to animals? I know that sometimes people may post on Facebook or, say that they have puppies for sale. Are all breeders harmful?
We do believe so. There is absolutely no excuse to be breeding animals while there's millions of animals languishing in city shelters. Here in New York City alone, New York City Animal Care Centers takes in anywhere from 20,000 to 30,000 homeless animals per year. I can't think of any good reason to justify breeding animals when we have animals that already need a home.
And can you tell me a little bit more about this bill and how it's going to protect these animals?
Sure. So this legislation that was passed by Assemblymember Linda Rosenthal and Senator Michael Gianaris would prohibit all pet stores across New York State from selling dogs, cats, and rabbits in all retail facilities. What they would be permitted to do is they would be able to have ad hoc events in their store where local rescues and shelters would be able to come and have events where animals could be offered for adoption. But what these pet stores would not be able to do is there would be zero financial transaction whatsoever between the rescues and the pet stores. Any type of fee that would be paid by potential adopters would go back to the rescue or to the shelter where the dogs, cats, or rabbits came from.
Oh, okay, so they're allowed to host like adoption day type of things. Okay, well
Yeah.
that's pretty good. I also wanted to know, would like Petco or PetSmart, I know that sometimes they also sell animals. Would they be considered like harmful places that contribute to puppy mills and stuff like that?
So Petco and PetSmart, as far as I know, do not sell dogs and cats, but they do sell other small animals. So yes, they are absolutely contributing to the problem. We currently have legislation in the City Council that was introduced by Councilmember Diana Ayala called Intro 4 that would prohibit all New York City pet stores from selling guinea pigs. The reason for that legislation is that we have seen a massive influx of thousands of guinea pigs that have been purchased in pet stores like Petco and PetSmart subsequently get dumped at our city's animal shelters. So it's not really fair that these private businesses are creating a problem that then becomes an issue for all of the local shelters and rescues in New York City.
Wow, thank you. I had no idea that was happening. So thank you for sharing. Now, as you mentioned, the bill would prohibit the sale of puppies, kittens, and rabbits in these stores. What is going to happen to those animals that are currently there?
It's a great question. There will be a phase out over time. A talking point that the industry likes to say is, oh, what are we going to do with those animals that they have? There are no shortage of shelters and rescuers right now that would gladly take those animals off of their hands, and they will have plenty of time to wind down their current business model and switch to a new business model that doesn't depend on animals' lives. There are thousands of pet stores all across New York State that have successfully made the transition from selling live animals to simply selling products that are made for pet owners, such as cat food, dog food, kitty litter, grooming, boarding, dog training, leashes, toys, you name it. And those stores have actually found that they're much more successful and have more longevity than stores that are selling live animals.
Now, I'm really curious to know what the consequences are for those who continue, because I think, as with anything, if they see a profit or they see if somebody wants a specific thing, I feel like there may be people who will still try. Do you know what the consequences for that is?
I believe the consequence is heavy fines. Um, I think there's always going to be a couple bad actors that are going to continue to try to operate, and we're going to leave it up to the New York State Attorney General to deal with them, just like they've done this year when there were some bad actors.
Now, I understand this bill could also protect potential buyers. As I mentioned, a lot of people don't really understand what's going on when they, go to get a puppy. So, can you explain why this is also going to protect them as well?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. This truly is a consumer protection bill as well as an animal rights protection bill, in that so many folks go to pet stores, they see that cute doggy in the window, they see the adorable puppies jumping up and down and yelping, and they think, oh, my heart, I have to take them home. But what they don't realize is that many of those animals are sick, they have injuries, they have illnesses that have not been properly treated within the pet store. If one dog gets sick in the pet store, they all get sick. And we have heard from countless consumers who have called us heartbroken after they've purchased a dog from a pet store and then the animal got extremely sick or died after just a few weeks.
Wow. Now, how can someone report a puppy mill or someone who's just breeding dogs?
Well, it's not illegal to just breed dogs in New York State. If you have a small breeding operation, you can get a license to do so. What we're really targeting are the mass out-of-state breeding operations that are then trafficking animals into New York. But to report animal abuse, you can reach out to our organization at vfar.org. You can email us, woof@vfar.org. You can also report it to your local police department or to the state attorney general's office.
Now, we talked about adoption a little bit. I really want to go into why adoption is so important. I know a lot of people, when they have an idea of the dog that they want, they may say, I want a Dalmatian or they want this specific dog. But why is it so important to themselves or to the animal that, you choose adoption?
It's so important to adopt because there are so many thousands, if not millions, of wonderful animals that are just waiting for a loving home. And they're just as deserving and just as loving as the, ideal animal that folks may be thinking of. And look, a Dalmatian is adorable, a Golden Doodle is adorable, but sometimes we have to make our consumer decisions based on what's ethically right for these animals more so than what it is that we want. Additionally, there are rescues for every different type of breed you can think of. My mom is a huge Schnauzer enthusiast. She's never had a problem adopting a Schnauzer from a rescue or a shelter, and we know that that's the same for just about every type of breed out there.
Now, what are some tips people should know when adopting? I know it's like a huge thing and people have the right intentions, but what is something that they should know before they decide to adopt?
I think definitely taking a good look at your lifestyle type. Are you working from home? That's going to have a big effect on the type of animal that you want to look to adopt. Do you have a yard? And by the way, you definitely do not need to have a yard in order to have a dog. Most New Yorkers, especially in New York City, do not have a yard. I think look at, do you have children in your home? What age are their children? Is your home quiet? Is your home loud? But any good shelter or rescue will be able to have a conversation with you and get to know you and your family and your lifestyle to help you better understand what the best type of companion animal would be best for your home.
Now, can you let everybody know how they can stay up to date with your organization?
Sure. You can check us out in several places. You can go to our website. It's vfar.org. We're also on Facebook and Instagram at Voters for Animal Rights, and we're on Twitter at The Animal Voters. One thing I also wanted to mention is we are currently waiting on Governor Kathy Hochul to sign the bill into law. She has until the end of the year to do that, and you can go to our website, vfar.org/puppy, to send her a quick email and encourage her to sign the bill.
All right, Allie, thank you so much. I definitely learned so much today, so I truly appreciate it.
Thank you so much for covering this important topic.
We'll be right back with more Open BxRx Tuesday.
We built a media network for you.
BronxNet TV.
Come learn in your new state-of-the-art studios at Lehman College.
At Mercy College.
And coming soon to the South Bronx in the Hub.
Inspire with your stories, culture, history.
Your Bronx on BronxNet.
Engage with us.
Connect with us at your channels and at BronxNet.tv.
Learn, engage, inspire. BronxNet TV.
From the Bronx
to the world.
BronxNet.
Despite strides towards racial equality, interracial marriages can still be met with uncertainty from different groups even in 2022. The national spokesman for Jehovah Witnesses, Robert J. Hendriks, joins us to discuss interracial marriage and its presence within their community. Robert, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having us.
Now, can you talk about how interracial marriage can be successful despite, times of uncertainty and times where racial tensions continue to escalate within our society?
The foundation of every great relationship is love. And it's not the kind of love that you see in rom-coms and not the kind of love that you see on Instagram, but the kind of love that's based on principle. Love isn't a feeling. I mean, that's part of it. But love is a verb. Love is action. And action provides the basis, the very foundation for a successful marriage. The Bible calls love the perfect bond of union. And so when we love like that, when it's based on principle, not simply on I feel good today, so I'm going to love you, that this kind of love you can't fall out of. And it's based on a love of the principles in the scriptures. It's based on a love of God. And that foundation really helps to bring two people together. It bridges the gaps. It makes sure that two people truly become one. So that unit becomes greater than the sum of its parts. Together, they're stronger than they were when they were two individuals. They accomplish more. They can do things that are unthinkable for one individual. And so as we think about this whole point, bridging the racial divide, that's what does it. And that common love that you have for your Creator, and that being the most important thing in our lives, that's what really helps you to bridge any gap and overcome any stumbling block. It's really, at the end of the day, love.
Now, I guess that could kind of lead into my next question. Why are mixed marriages not uncommon for Jehovah Witnesses?
As Jehovah's Witnesses, I think the Pew Research Center says we are the most diverse religion in the United States. So it just makes sense that when you live together, when you grow up together, making that leap to an interracial marriage is rather just natural because, the problem with so many people, and it's not their fault, is that they grow up with one type of people. And when we think about our whole life is curated, right? It's curated by technology. So I curate my friends, those who are around me, who think like me, who look like me. But I curate the things that I read because Facebook doesn't allow me to see anything that I don't like or agree with. And all of a sudden, all you've got is one view of the world, one color in the world, one language in the world. But when you grow up as a Jehovah's Witness, it's so typical for you to be growing up with brown, black, all sorts of colors, all sorts of languages. I grew up in my congregation as a young boy. We grew up in mostly a black congregation. There were some Puerto Ricans. There were also those who were deaf, who we had to sign for them. Others had to sign for them. This was a community, and we grew up in that community. That community loved one another, and you didn't see people in color or language. You saw them for who they were inside. And so I think that basis of life in growth and growing up, even if you didn't come from an integrated community, you've gone to an integrated congregation that has really expanded your horizons and made you understand other people in ways that so few people, honestly, in this country get to understand.
Now, I like that you brought that up because I do think that in a lot of our communities, even in New York City, we're lucky to kind of be around different groups of people. But even within that, sometimes you can stay close to your community and you don't really get the chance to meet other people or understand different cultures. What would you say is a challenge for interracial couples or marriages when they're met or facing other people who are usually within the same community?
I think that it really it comes down to not thinking so much about yourself. When we think about ourselves, that's all we want to surround ourselves with is people like us. But I think we celebrate the diversity in our community. When we did what was called special metropolitan witnessing down in Bryant Park, and right now I live in Walk Hill, and I live among a diverse group of people. But there's nothing more diverse than standing on 42nd Street between 5th and 6th and seeing all day and hearing all day different languages and cultures. And instead of saying to yourself, wow, why don't they speak English or why don't they look like me? Getting to know each of these people, getting to know those types of people, making sure your feet are under their table, that you've embraced them. And when you get to know somebody, whatever color or language they speak, you get to love them. And you begin to love their culture, not just their food. You know, we're good with food, right? Everybody loves Thai food and soul food and everything, but the people behind that culture. And so even though in many ways Jehovah's Witnesses are very much the same when it comes to our beliefs, right? We still embrace each other's culture. We still love that about each other, and we don't want to homogenize that. And I think that's something to be celebrated, and that's a different view for many people in the world. You know, we have studied as congregations around the world, we have talked about the importance of welcoming immigrants, the importance of welcoming those refugees. And that's completely opposite. You get out of our congregation meetings and then you read the paper or listen to the news, and it's completely opposite to the world. So I think it's not just being among people, but it's getting to know them and getting to love them.
I think that was really cool that you mentioned that too, because I feel like as we talk about race more in our country, a lot of what you said, people said, you know, you should embrace the person behind the culture. So it's not just saying you love this type of food, but loving the person who's bringing that and sharing that with you. So I thought that was really cool. And I saw the connection between that. Now, if an interracial couple decides to pursue a relationship or a marriage, what would you say is something that they can do to prepare themselves for success?
You know, they need to talk. And first of all, they need to understand right off the bat that there are challenges, that not everybody around them will be happy, sometimes even family members. But they need to individually be firm in their own decision with each other. And the only way that can happen is real communication. You know, on dates and in movies and on Instagram, we think about people talking about the food that they like, the movies that they like, all the way they like to dress, the places that they want to vacation. Well, those are all good things, but you can get that done in a half an hour with somebody. But it takes many, many days, weeks, and even years to really understand the soul of somebody. And so on jw.org, there is, if you go down to the homepage, you'll see something on families. It'll be a box. It'll say for families and couples and families. And you go into that and you start talking about things like communication. You start confronting the issue of how are we going to feel when others jeer at us walking down the street in New York City, which has happened to my wife and me. How are we going to feel when my uncle doesn't come to my wedding because he doesn't agree with my choice? How are we going to deal with that individually? And you need to go through that up front. You need, and your response to those things and your response to problems in your marriage needs to become reflexive. You don't have to think, what should I do now? But you've already discussed it. You know what you're going to do. You have a plan of action, and that plan of action is to stay unified, to stay together no matter what.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I want to know what qualities are needed, and we talk about racial, but I guess just in any marriage, what qualities are needed just to be successful?
I think the number one quality outside of love is humility, and love and humility are very much linked. Philippians chapter 2, verse 3 is talking about, that chapter is talking about Christ and how when he came, how he acted. The smartest, most powerful, most amazing person who's ever lived was the most humble person who ever lived. And it says in verse 3, it says to treat others as superior to you. Treat others as superior to you. That means there's no place for ethnocentrism. Yes, we're proud of who we are. We're proud of our heritage, but we don't lift that above others. That's how Jehovah's Witnesses have stayed peaceful and unified around the world. We're in 240 lands. And so we don't go in, we don't think that U.S. or Mexico or Finland, we don't elevate country or ethnicity or language. We elevate the person. And if you start looking at a person as superior to you, you're going to look for the qualities where that person is actually better than you. And when you do that, you want to serve them because that's what humility is all about. You want to learn from them. And in a marriage, that's an amazing quality, to be able to sit back and learn from your wife, who is very different from you, or her from her husband. And it's a beautiful quality that, you know what, makes people more lovable. And so it has that effect too. Not only is it better for the relationship, but it makes you more lovable. And so humility, I think, would be a key.
Now, what are some resources the Jehovah Witness offers that can help guide people with healthy family relationships?
You know, my wife and I still each week we practice what we call a family worship time. And for many Jehovah's Witnesses, they look to jw.org. There's 200,000 videos, 600,000 articles, many of which are on marriage and family and communication, on dating and courtship and the proper attitude toward your wife and husband, on dealing with problems, dealing with addiction, all the things that we confront in marriage. And being able to look at those resources together on the homepage, going just right down to the middle and seeing and clicking on those unlimited resources, it's really a treasure trove for those who want to make themselves better and also improve their marriage.
All right, Robert, thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having us.
That's all for our show today. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Kibin Alleyne, wishing you and yours safety and wellness now and always. See you next time.